So good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's session of the lunch seminar on Japanese economy and society, co-organized by the French Institute of Research on Japan at the Maison Franco-Japonaise and the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, France-Japon, with the support of the French Embassy in Japan. My name is Adrienne SALA. I'm a social science researcher at the Institute, and I'm very happy to host my colleague Gilles Campagnolo today. Gilles Campagnolo is full research director in economic philosophy at the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, in Aix-Marseille School of Economics in France. He is also a researcher at the French Institute of Research on Japan at the Maison Franco-Japonaise and associate member at London School of Economics at the Center for the Philosophy of Natural and Social Science. He is the principal investigator of the International Research Network of the Institute for Humanities and Social Science, Justice and Interest. He is the co-editor of the Review of Economic Philosophy and the translator, commentator of the founding works of the Austrian School of Liberal Economics, as well as numerous articles and books on economic philosophy, liberal thought, of which some are in a comparative perspective between Western scholar and Japan. Today, Gilles Campagnolo will present his field of research, economic philosophy, by displaying its key feature through an introduction to its tradition in France and in Japan. Actually, the topic of today's presentation echoes another event we are organizing on June 7, 8, and 9 in collaboration with the DIJ and the NERA about the future of liberalism, Japan, France, and Germany in global context. This will be a 3-day online symposium to discuss the concept at the basis of the varieties of liberalism and their evolution in response to the major crisis they are experiencing since the 1930s. All the information is available on the MFJ website. Gilles Campagnolo, you promise us to make the field easy to understand, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adrienne, and thank you to all the audience for being here. This is the last lunch seminar of the season, so I was very glad to present it during the old season since last September. We had hosts in different topics from the US, the UK last time with George Olcott last week. We had many talks on governance and companies and business. We had also a presentation of economic sectors in different industries in Japan, like wood, etc. This time, since I'm allowing myself the liberty to talk about my own field of research, it will be more historical and somehow more philosophical. In this order, first part more history, second part more philosophy of economics. It is about economics. It has consequences on business, but very, very downstream. So it's less business-oriented and practical economics-oriented than usual lunch seminars. So I ask for your indulgence and your attention. So I say simply, please do not leave because of that. First part, historical perspective on two traditions that I will summarize or present quickly in France and in Japan without any intent to be exhaustive on the topic, and any questions about those traditions more in detail will be welcome. I may even learn from some of you, so please do contribute and let's exchange on that. The second part is definitely about what is the topic that I'm talking about. 経済哲学とは何か? What is this field? When one speaks about moral philosophy or political philosophy, well, you may even ask people around you in the street, not only your colleagues at institutions, but anyone would at least kind of think they have an idea of what it is about. Whereas the term economic philosophy is less common and less used. I will try to show what it is and why this quest for an adequate word displays important underlying conceptual issues for the topic. I will also give a panoramic view of its use and interest, and try to map the field in a very simple graph to make it easily understandable and easy to memorize. As we say in French, un dessin vaut parfois mieux qu'un long discours. There are tasks at hand for that field, and those are manifold. I will insist on the task of reflection, which is specifically what the philosophers maybe arrogantly think that they can provide, and choices and values that are of interest for any of us, not only specialists in those fields, but even the layman, and actually any and all citizens and economic agents that we, each and every one of us, are. First part, in general perspective. So historically, we may go back as far as Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, where discussion about the nature of exchange between different individuals is set forth, whereas partnership is mentioned on book 8 and 9, like the third kind of philia, that is the love, a kind of love, whose last and third form is a partnership. And partnership is also what we use in normal business life when we exchange one another. There are commonalities, there are different stages and bridges that notionally bring together moral philosophy, economic philosophy, political philosophy, and those were built along the course of history by different and major names that we have all heard about, and that we tend to attribute or assign to one field or another. If I say Adam Smith, one not only thinks of the wealth of nations, but is an economist. Actually, he was a professor of moral philosophy. One talks about Hume and his treatise of human nature, and actually as the main settings for the understanding of economics in a capitalist, modern, liberal frame, etc., etc. As for myself, as Adrienne kindly mentioned, I have essentially worked on the Austrian tradition and its founder, Karl Menger, whose works on the theoretical principles of economics and the methodology of the research in social sciences have been lately translated into French, whereas they exist in other languages for a long time. Now, we are talking about big names, quote, Hegel, Marx, and recently John Rawls, Amartya Sen, etc. Actually, to give a structure to the field of economic philosophy, sorry for the typos on the screen, we may not only rely on those major historical figures and characters, we may not be satisfied only to survey the field, but we must try to ensure that inside both disciplines and their academic representations in our institutions, there are ongoing programs that can be developed. Adrienne already mentioned what we will be organizing next week. There are other things that I will mention at the end of the talk. The point is that the field is not only due to major thinkers of the past who contributed it quite incidentally, maybe for some at the end or peripherally to their other works in economics or in general philosophy. This is the novelty of economic philosophy now is the result of regular work that is being done by philosophers and economists who cross the boundaries of their own fields in order to see and to understand what's being done by the others with them, and actually how they both need each other. Inference for tradition. After I mentioned those big names worldwide, let me concentrate in France. Actually, the term itself appears for the first time in the book called Première introduction à la philosophie économique ou analyse des états policés in 1771 by Nicolas Baudot, who was a physiocrat, a member of the school directed by François Quesnay, the physician of Louis XV, who based the understanding of economics on nature, agriculture, and providence. I mention his name because it means that economic philosophy and the Enlightenment, what we call in French les Lumières, are definitely fundamentally intricate from the start. Incidentally, I mentioned that Nicolas Baudot was a master of an abbey in Vilno, which is Lithuania, which are the parts a little north, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, where we have now now separate at the time in one big state of Poland and Lithuania, etc. A major state of the time that has had many trouble and different difficulties, especially at present, again, as we know, as war is back in Europe. That's just to mention in passing. This tradition from that time, from the Enlightenment to now, has been inventoried, worked on, researched at different times along a host of, with a host of contributors that it is impossible here to name. If some of you want me to detail more, I will do during the questions. Let's just say that from the 1990s on to now, especially in the south of France at Aix-en-Provence, revival and a real in-depth organized research on the topic has been provided by economists such as Louis-André Gérard-Varret and Alain Leroux, who created the Review of Economic Philosophy. Here it is, if I don't know if you can see it on the screen. Published by Librairie Philosophique Vrin, Sorbonne Square, and by philosophers like Pierre Livet, Philippe Grille, whom I recently edited in the series that I'm heading for a publishing company in Paris. Those efforts were renewed from previous times. So those were not what in English the expression calls the first penguins, but they were actually quite important in making it a field reckoned as such by the profession, besides what existed in the Anglo-Saxon world, like Economics and Philosophy, the review at Cambridge University Press. To give an example of what's being done and give some information in Japanese, some slides will be in Japanese to help for the part of the audience that read this like that. Yeah. Second tradition. So first part, second section. What happened in Japan? Well, we all know that with the Meiji Shin restoration, Western ideas came, but they had actually already obtained in Japan previously during the Bakufu, especially at the end of its period of time, when the government sent various delegations to Europe, to courts and universities. What they discovered were different disciplines from what that existed already in Japan or in the East in general. They had to coin new terms in order to accommodate those ideas in the Japanese framework. And this is how, for example, the term tetsugaku was coined by Nishi Amane in 1862. And it is the main name that remains associated with the discipline philosophy in Japanese today. Actually, there were other competing proposals, including by Fukuzawa Yukichi and others, but they, in the end, a mix of circumstances, success of some publications and not of others, influence of those people. Nishi Amane was well introduced in the administrative, governmental spheres of Japanese power. All those mixed made some words remain, and those are the ones that we use. For example, Nakae Chomin coined that of aesthetics, bigaku. Also, that remains to our day. And he did that especially at the same time that he was translating l'esthétique by Eugène Véron, which has been forgotten mostly, but also he was translating Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And as we know, Chomin became the kind of Rousseau of the East. That time was a time of introducing those ideas. What about economics then? Well, the term seiji at the time was used widely and could be understood as the way that economic things were regarded. But with the introduction of the new words that were coined, seiji became more associated directly to politics, and this is the meaning that it has now. Keizai gaku, as for itself, comes from a shorthand of the proverb keisei zaimin, which is kuni o sameru on one hand, govern the country, and jinmin no suku on the other hand, protect the people. The term came to mean exclusively Western economics. Actually, what was regarded as economic matters previously, like stories of traders, etc. If we think of Hihara Saikaku and the beginning of Japanese capitalism in the 17th century, the way that prices were put onto merchandise at the time already in Japan independently from the West, etc. That has its own history. But when the term Keizai Gaku was really introduced, it became used for the Western economics. What about then what is of interest to us, that is Keizai Tetsugaku, economic philosophy? Well, there are the specificities of Japanese capitalism, and there are the way that the Japanese understood the introduction of those disciplines, the philosophy, the economics, the way they would mix them. Economic philosophy, Keizai Tetsugaku, is not only a word that existed in French as we saw from the 18th century, but you could find it in the dictionary as an entry, in the Dictionary of Economic Thought as an entry in the interwar. It disappeared later on, but it was existing at the time. So it was partly influenced by the import of Western disciplines and ideas, and partly a creation, a genuine creation from the Japanese economists of the time. Among those, one should name especially Kiichiro Soda Kiichiro, and Sugimura Kozo, whose name appear there. And this presence indicates the effective existence of a tradition in Japan. The question is to which extent it is idiosyncratic. Well, I put a quote from Morishima Michio at the top of the screen. That is that there is a remarkably idiosyncratic ethos that prevails in Japanese society, and as a result of these ethical feelings, Japanese capitalism has to a considerable extent deviated from the typical free enterprise system. The question is why the possessors of this kind of non-Western attitude come to gain such control over the industrial techniques produced by the West. Techniques and spirit. Words are introduced, translated, and get a meaning that is the result of a mix between the original meaning in the West and the existing frames in Japan. The mix that is the result of that is sometimes difficult to recognize from the point of view of the Western side. The exchange is thus twofold. It is a mutual process, a reciprocal process. For a long time, Westerners coming to the East have had either a paternalistic attitude or, on the contrary, a reverence and awe in front of the East, luxurious China or sober and long-traditioned Japan as well. What happens with such a field is that it gives the chance for reciprocal exchange and understanding, creating together the discipline that is evolving through times. I quoted the interwar period. More recently, someone like Shionoya Yuichi recalled the word and the role of the two scholars, revived that, and made it again available for the Japanese audience, while analyzing in his works the knowledge of the Joseph Schumpeter tradition and the role of the welfare state in Japan. It is by mixing practical concerns for for economic policies, Seisaku, and the importance of economic historical thought and economic theory that the field gets alive, is alive. That's what we tried, by the way, to put forth in a special issue of the Review of Economic Philosophy mentioned before, that was dedicated to this tradition in Japan and in between the West and Japan. Here there is a long quote by Shionoya, which I put there in order just to make the point about these historical traditions clear. Soda and Sugimura thought they gave original contributions that were authentically Japanese, based on post-Kantian philosophy. The influence of German ideas and the notion of bunkakachi, of value, cultural values, and of the role of values inside the performing economics, inside the practice of economists, is one of the essential aspects of what they wanted to put forth. So, post-Kantian and Japanese, making a tradition that existed as such during the interwar, with concerns for the prevailing value of the ethics of justice, the notion of ethics, virtue, trying to make compatible in some way those two traditions. The Western, so I mentioned France, let's put the German influence with Kant and the post-Kantian schools as well, and the Japanese one. I leave you a little bit the time to read the quote by Shionoya, whose texts actually are for some in English, as well as, of course, in Japanese, but not in French, except in the special issue of the journal that I presented, where two of them have been, for the first time, translated into French with the agreement of Shionoya's daughter and the kind authorization of Tokyo University Press. So, today in Japan, like in the West, the crisis that economic theories, we mentioned the case of the liberal theory especially, meet and sometimes fail to meet or to mend, are caused that more and more academics debate the models that they once took for granted. And they are constrained to feel the need for the reflexive attitude that is actually exactly what economic philosophy promotes. In that sense, times of crisis are times of change, and because that change calls for a new understanding, a rethinking of the field itself, it calls for a kind of revival of economic philosophy. This also suggests that we do not keep only to give the historical long-term perspective, but we care about what is presently done, and I will say a few words of that at the end. But now, after this first historical part, introducing, showing what only some aspects of the traditions in France and in Japan, I would like to explain, because you may still be wondering what we are talking about. So actually, 経済哲学とは何か? Well, here it comes. This is, by the way, the issue of the journal that I mentioned. Now, what is it? First, as I mentioned earlier, moral philosophy, political philosophy are words that we are all used to hear, even if we don't really know exactly what we would put under them or which authors we would prefer to mention. Economic philosophy is less much so, and this is why the literature has used various different terminology and various words in order to point to the field where philosophy and economics intersect, where they overlap, or where they are disjointed and rejoined for some reason. Maybe one way to understand that well is to go through the various words that are concerned. Let me then try to analyze that. This slide will be in Japanese, but I will comment it in English. I mentioned that besides the Review of Economic Philosophy, the most well-known journal in the field is Economics and Philosophy by Cambridge University Press. And the label itself shows the difficulty. What is the meaning of "and" in economics and philosophy? Is it something that unites both fields? I mean, everything that is in philosophy would be in economics, everything that is in economics would be in philosophy? Of course not. Is it what is only at the intersection, but then you have to define it? And actually, it is not that easy. So the point about this expression, it is too vague, and it also puts a secondary trouble in which order you mention them. Economics and philosophy. Economics is number one, philosophy is secondary, or philosophy and economics. Actually, for the journal in question, I asked the person in charge at Cambridge UP. It started 20 years, almost, 25 years ago. So actually, it's the tradition that I have heard, and not the person of the time, saying that it was them, the press, that decided the order, partly for euphony, for the sound of it, and partly because they think that economics comes first. Well, as long as you have that kind of discussion, maybe it's not the way that you can really progress. So there has been other proposals, the proposals of philosophy of economics. And this comes from applying to that field what exists in philosophy of sciences, where there is philosophy of biology, philosophy of physics, philosophy of whatever, and just name it. The problem of it is much that it would show philosophy as definitely arrogant. There are some fields that could be dealing what they want to do within for themselves, but if you want to seize them, to grasp them, then you have to have this attitude where you are outside and over looking at them. It is properly what makes it arrogant, and that gives an approach that is too self-assured, too conscious of itself as being so sure of what it's bringing. Like the philosopher basically is the censor. Economists do what they want, but there is a guy who knows about the method. There is a guy who knows about the field of the others and could say what is and what is not to be done or said. It also tends, therefore, to restrict the notion of economic philosophy to the epistemological or methodological aspect. Those are the other existing labels, by the way, because there is, next one, economic methodology, there is a journal of economic methodology, which is doing actually what economic philosophers do, but applied only to economics, to the methodology of economics. And the word methodology is not that clear in itself as well. Of course, it's, according to the Greek etymology, the right way to do things, methodos. What is the right way? What is the correct way to do things? It is in itself an issue for philosophers. So the sense of the word methodology and the use of methods is depending on the evolution of those methods, and the approach that is restricting economic philosophy to its methodology is at the same time an approach that would say something like economics exists. The method to deal with it comes from outside, or then is already practiced without clear knowledge by the economists. We have to clarify it. We come after. Economics is being done without philosophy by people who act unconsciously with their methods, and we are clarifying that. So it's once again the risk of an arrogant approach, or if it is on the contrary, if it wishes to be a modest approach, then it becomes a second-hand approach. Moreover, what is the real extension of the field? As I said, the Journal of Economic Methodology publishes some works that could very well be in economics and philosophy or in the review of economic philosophy. The same issues go with, the economic epistemology approach. Sorry for the fact that it's not in perfect order. I am kind of clumsy with the tools that are used. Like for methodology, to think that epistemology, episteme being science, logos, the reasonable, rational discourse about science, is something that is obvious, would be once again a mistake or an approach that is too quick. The difference between the words in French, German, and English illustrate it well. Erkenntnislehre is closer to the theory of knowledge than to epistemology. The word in German does not have the same semantic extension as it has in English. And if we take the English epistemology, we may have a social epistemology, which is actually quite fashionable in those fields at present times, and which is quite difficult to translate into French as épistémologie sociale without making a mistake in the contents of the works that's being done and of the conceptual characterizations that is behind it. So once again, the term is not that clear. And again, it incurs, it meets the risk of being an approach, a second-hand approach, or an approach that is falsely modest while tending to rein in the field. The extension of the field is also an issue. And after those four expressions already, you see that a field is building itself when you see its names being competing one another. I said it for the Japanese disciplines at the end of the 19th century when they were imported from the West, competing words, competing ideas of what the field and the discipline could be. It is the case here with the numerous proposals to give a name to that field. Another proposal was philosophical economics. Actually, all those proposals, let it be clear, are not mine, but actually existing in the literature. I don't give the list of the different papers, books, etc., that use those words in French and in English, but they actually exist with all those different expressions, titles of journals and titles of books, papers, etc. And this uncertainty about what to use shows the underlying uncertainty about the concept and what has to be described by it. I mean, there is meaning in the words. It's not an issue just words and words, words, words. It is an issue of underlying extension and understanding of the field. Another proposal then was philosophical economics, which gives priority to the substantive, the noun, economics, but which is mostly and interestingly a parallel to mathematical economics. Mathematical economics would point to the part of economics where mathematics are used. Well, for us today, it's everything in economics like that. But this is the result of a progress and a process during time. From the end of the 19th century to today, this has developed as such a mathematization of economics, which was not necessarily the case before, and which is since that time, but also in our times, not necessarily the case for non-mainstream or non-orthodox economics. Not everything is mathematics in economics. Then what is mathematical in it would be some kind of use of methods, would be some kind of understanding of notions, would be the fact that it makes economics more tractable. Those advantages given by mathematics pushes us to use the word mathematical economics. If we think of the Japanese tradition, after World War II, Kindai Keizai-gaku, so-called modern economics, actually put in under one big label most of everything that was new and that had to do with modeling and mathematics in Japanese import of Western economics. Econometrics of the interwar, post-Keynesian models, microeconomics, where the individual is modeling its behavior, all that was put under the label of Kindai Keizai-gaku. The common point being the mathematics. Mathematics by the Marxists belonged to the Marxist side of economics, which was different from Kindai Keizai-gaku, but that was mostly the exception of it. Now, is philosophical economics something like that? Is there a philosophy that is everywhere inside the field of economics? Or does it restrict the use of philosophy to a subfield of what is economics? Does it make philosophical economics a section of all of economics? Or does it imply that philosophy is actually pervading the whole of the field in its different subfields, like industrial economics, like foreign international economics, import and export in trade, etc. Therefore, the term is not clear enough in our view. This is why we tend to prefer, and we have the preference, we think the adequate expression will be economic philosophy as such. Also, it is the title of the journal, and this is related. This is the reason why. Economic philosophy thus tends, which is used in French and in English, even if philosophy of economics is more frequent in English, the use of economic philosophy is stressing that aspect. Again, if among all the previous proposals you choose one, you meet some of the disadvantages that I mentioned. Economic philosophy is immune to most of those. The fact that it is still less used in English than philosophy of economics shows the following. The influence of the philosophy of science as such, and the idea that economics would be a field so well understood and clearly delineated and defined that you could grasp it and seize it and make it the object of your philosophy. This is a mistake in the understanding of what is at stake here. What is at stake is rather how the fundamental concepts of what mainstream or non-mainstream, orthodox or heterodox economics is working. When people are doing model, what are they doing? And you understand that not only through methodology and epistemology, but through all the sides of economic philosophy, that is the reflexive attitude of the scientist, here the economist, wondering about the tools that she is using. This self-reflexive attitude is what makes philosophy, whatever the place where philosophy is being practiced. In economic philosophy, it is to reveal inside economics the elements that are necessarily by construction philosophical. Some unconsciously used by the economist, some consciously used by the economist, who then need and call for the expertise of the professional philosopher. It doesn't give the expertise of the professional philosopher a overarching position, because without the question of the economist, his expertise is useless in that field. Without the understanding that the philosopher provides when discussing the concepts, the models of the economist remain unsatisfactory. And we have observed lately in the West, at different times, crisis of the studies in economics. Economic studies where students were not satisfied, where teachers themselves were not satisfied, and where researchers were either deaf to changes that happened in different crises, or when listening, when willing to give an ear to those sounds and difficulties, then sometimes unarmed and in disarray in front of the situation. Economists and philosophers need to work together. This is economic philosophy. And in Japan and in Japanese, it already existed. It has its own tradition, as I recalled it. This is Keizai Tetsugaku, since the words already existed. So let me get back to slides in English to give, now that I have explained why the word is important, and by doing so discussed the underlying aspects and the underlying stakes in the existence of that field, let's try to give some panoramic view, positive view, not only saying what it is not and why the words are not what they should be, but what you put in positively, let's say. The kind of critic, because it is a critical attitude, because a reflexive attitude is necessarily critical. Critical doesn't mean to say reproaches and to be harsh and to be crying or shouting or being filled with indignation or whatever, right? Those are attitudes that are not the scientific attitude. The critic, as its original technical meaning could be found, for example, in Kant, is the cold-blooded separating of a good and ungood use of reason, characterization of the use of reasons inside science. Faire le partage entre un bon et un mauvais usage de la raison dans la pratique des sciences, to say it in French, sorry. The kind of critique that economic philosophy thus fosters can be regarded as adequately used in all the fields that are listed here. We are discussing not only methodology, we're discussing not only the philosophy of science, we're discussing also the beings that are acknowledged as existing by the scientists who practice science. What's in the zoo of the economists as economic agents? What is the ontology? What is the social economic ontology of science? What is its means and its methods and practices? What are the cogs and wheels of the functioning of not only economics, but its relationships to the neighboring social sciences? What is its use of description in positive economics and of norms in normative economics? What is downstream the legitimacy of prescriptions made by economics? Positive, normative, prescriptive. All those are susceptible of a reflexive attitude. And the notions that are distinguishing between what is rational, reasonable, probable, plausible, those are fundamental notions that influence this field and that have direct impact on practical economics. You're talking about projections about the climate and the diversity, biological diversity or evolution of climate, etc. You are wondering about what is probable to happen, then the economists give in the IPCC report, for example, probabilities, 2%, this in that case, in that case, in that case. What is plausible in the attitude of humanity with regard to that? Probability as mathematically computed and plausibility of the effective outcome are two different notions. Now, to discuss such notions, you are doing by discussing them, you are doing philosophy, whether you call it like that or not, and you need people who are working on these notions. This is true for many fields, especially as they develop when they are new or when they are in blossoming, like, for example, I put this, I just mentioned worries about ecology, developmental things, but you have also the simulation in social sciences, where if you do simulations and not only modeling, and if you do models that are not necessarily reducible to mathematical methods, making them tractable through mathematics, but with the use of computers, you are actually evoking the nature of the data and the agents that you put in. Multiple individual-based approach in simulation needs economic philosophy, as do other fields. Let me be, since time is passing, let me summarize all that up. Sorry for the slide that's in French, but I will translate in English. It's quite self-telling anyhow. The circle at the top is what could be described as works in moral and political philosophy and political economy. The cycle with the dotted line is epistemology and methodology, as far as they are economic epistemology and economic methodology. And the last circle is the philosophy of action and theory of decision. This is one among many possible descriptions of the field of economic philosophy. There are others. For example, Uskalimaki prefers to that kind of representations a lot of tables with vertical, horizontal, positive, negative, etc., lines and columns. While his major works in economic philosophy are well known and very important all over, not only in the Anglo-Saxon world, but all over, we tend to prefer a representation where things overlap. There are works, papers, books, etc., that could come into the intersections of those circles here. Some of them belong to one subfield in those three. Some of them are at the intersection. The way they overlap is what makes their interest major. And so therefore, if you want a description, if you want a diagram telling you about the nature of the field itself, you have to make space for those works that are not strictly falling into one area. And you want to make that in order to give right, to make justice to their reflexive attitude. Economic philosophy, a work in economic philosophy is accepted if it tells the reader, if it puts the reader in a situation to wonder what it is about. The philosophical attitude has to be present. It is not just giving facts. It is not about what is what can be listed as positive elements only. It is the attitude of mind towards those elements. So what are the tasks and what should be avoided? First, again, once again, starting by what is not the case. That is a very philosophical and maybe not quite efficient way of doing things, but we try first to avoid and to put aside what is not the case before we try to come to what is the case. First, there are two pitfalls in what I've just described. One is that economic philosophy could become some kind of black hole that little by little absorbs all the matter of the economics, mainstream economics fundamentals, heterodox approaches, the relationships with the adjacent social sciences and how boundaries are crossed. All that, because of the reflexive attitude that I mentioned, that I insisted on, would actually become all a discourse of philosophy, and our philosophy would become any and all talk about what the field is, right? It would dissolve itself into, I didn't put the word, but basically into ideology. it would dissolve itself into being a general talk without the tools that philosophers bring in to separate the good, the correct, and the incorrect, inaccurate use of reason inside the sciences. Philosophy is not general talk. Ideology can be general talk if it has an agenda. Any agenda has some kind of philosophy built upon, ideology built upon some philosophy somewhere, but it is not philosophy in as much this wants to be used for the sake of science itself, and economic philosophy as economic in its name in order to make that clear. So it's not all another thing goes. Second, it is not the other risk, the pending one. It is not too close. It is not a matter that is closed on itself. It cannot be a discipline that you list in the curriculum like you list the other. There is a course 1.0 in industrial economics. There is course 1.0 in economic philosophy. Of course, you can do that, but you don't exhaust the content of this attitude because this will pervade in the rest. What you do in 1.0 economic philosophy course, actually I have taught some, is that you make the minds of the students in economics open to what your colleagues do not teach. You make them understand why they are not satisfied when they criticize the way that they are taught economics. And you do that positively, because as long as it is just criticizing the curriculum, it doesn't change the curriculum anyway. What changes what they understand is if they are able to formulate it as points that they want, that they are interested in this or that, in a reflexive, with a reflexive attitude. So it is key that you avoid both excessive generalization, anything goes, and basically you fall inside ideology, or that you shut yourself into one corner only, and that you forget what is really brought, what is really the input of science as it is practiced by your colleague scientists. So it is key and that economic philosophy may be able to follow the process of economic science in the making. You are working with the economists, not against them, saying, oh, they are bad people, for example, they are all liberals or whatsoever. You are not working against something if you want to understand what it is. You're working with it and you're working within it and from within it. And then understanding it, you make it acceptable to understand, and you avoid what is more, unfortunately, mostly the case, that is a systematic rejection by people in one field of what is concerning and questioning their field. Questioning a field is not making it feel bad. If you do so, you just lose your time and miss your target. Actually, I think that the great positive impact of Shionoya in Japan, especially by reviving the notion of bunkakachi that was taken from German philosophy, value philosophy, Werttheorien of the end of the 19th century, was to give such access in Japanese and in Japan to that view on thing. The ontology, the axiological, sorry for the typo, the reasoning on the causes of what makes economics the field that it is, and this is what one should call attention to. And you, Shionoya Yuichi, did that in Japan, I think. Maybe I mix some of my views with his own, but I would be unfair to his works, but I would also think that it is a way to make them of interest to the listeners and to push you, to incite you to check on his work in the original, which I will not have the time to do here. So the 3 points to finish shortly. reflection. I insisted already too much on it. One thing about mathematical economics, mathematical use of mathematics in economics is that oftentimes its advantage that it makes things tractable is outweighed by its disadvantage that through formalization and modelization, some important features are left aside. Basically, the modeler sometimes does not really know what is modeling at the moment that is doing. Economics just regard those notions as tools, while economic philosophy focuses on those as concepts as such, how they intricate and how they bring in collaterals. And because it claims that economic theories and its fundamentals are its subjects, then the field of economic philosophy implies to be extended to the whole of economics without becoming the black hole that I mentioned. The main point is that at the end of a paper where you have model and where the translation from the equations and the models are summed up in 5 lines in the conclusion, there is something missing. Economic philosophy is the way to get the author of that paper talk with someone who is questioning what is actually put in those 5 lines and that has not been made explicit. So let me have it shortly in Japanese for the audience. It's all about gainen. A paper in economics with equations is very fine and very useful as long as the concepts that are implicit in it can be made more explicit and at least as explicit as the mathematical formulas that are in it. It's also about choice, because any study in economic analysis is a matter of choices, one and many. These choices imply not to answer queries formulated at the technical level in the actual doings of science, but the issues that are raised when those technical things are put in. The consequence is that there are commitments in making choices. You may be in favor of this or that position for reasons that are not scientific. It's your problem, you defend the cause, you're not doing science. Well, when you're doing science, you're also making choices. If those choices are influenced by something else than your interest for finding a possible truth in the field that you're exploring, not only you have to make it explicit, but you have to say that there is some epistemological or ontological commitment in it. And if it is political, you have to be, or moral, you have to be aware that it is not economic as such. It is parallel. It may be legitimate, or it may not be, but anyway, it is different. Moral and political are related to economics, but the real commitments are not those. They are the ethical, epistemological, and ontological commitments to what you are doing when you are choosing this or that object in the science that you are actually building and practicing. The word engagement in French is quite good in that sense. You may think of the scientist as a kind of penseur engagé, in as much as this engagement is not regarded as a political positioning. Now, we in France have this kind of disadvantage, which is not necessarily the case as much, at least in other civilizations, to make it immediately political. Well, those epistemological and ontological commitments are as much important, and they are acceptable as long as they are made explicit. Not everything is about ideology, but the aspects that are determined by some underlying Weltanschauung vision of the world, understanding of the world, have to be put forth clearly. To say it again differently, the fact that there are commitments in any choice you make when you study some economic object does not make your position immediately ideological. It makes it ideological if you do not clarify and make explicit the commitments at all different levels. It makes it ideological, especially if you defend some position in the name of the science that you're building, making the positive science a makeup, a pretending appearance for what is actually a normative or even more a prescriptive position. Those things have to be disentangled. And by the way, the ones who are criticizing ideology the most are the most ideological ones. Of course, this is what main predecessors have quite well illustrated in the past. If someone tells you to be suspicious of something, first, be suspicious of the one who is telling you. That's a cautious and prudential way to do things. Now, it is necessary to set forth and to explain that there are such visions at those different levels, and not to wish to destroy them or to discriminate or to incriminate them, calling what is not your side some ideology. Actually, the only reflexive attitude there is to try to put yourself in a position above those different sides and not to fight in one camp or the other. This is what economic philosophy allows to do. And again, how do I go to the next? Oh. Yes. Okay. In a few words in Japanese, and you will tell me, please, in the audience, Japanese people, if the engagement katakana writing makes sense if it is used in Japanese in a text like that. Commitment in English, but engagement in French is more or a little different from commitment. Anyway, last, and I finish on that because I understand that I have come suddenly the time. The values. I mentioned them with Shionoya discussing his revival of the Bunkakachi understanding by Sugimura and Soda, which was in turn taken from the German Werttheorie and Wertphilosophie of the end of the 19th century. A discourse in economics, since it is based at some point upon choices that should be made explicit, also carries values and is laden with such values. Again, the point is to make them explicit by the attitude that economic philosophy makes available. There is a consubstantial relationship between what sciences produces and values. And like Max Weber said already 1 century ago, there is nothing new in that. The conflict between values is not solved at the scientific level. It is solved when those values are confronted and discussed, and they can be effectively, efficiently, and interestingly only by philosophy. When they are not, they fall back again into the world and they make people fight against each other. And fight is the common way things are going, but it does not have necessarily to be, at least all the time. Okay, basically what I have just advocated is a theory of self-consciousness in the use of science. And I told you that this session of the lunch seminar would be somehow different from the usual ones. I hope that it was interesting for you. I will just make very shortly, like Adrienne did, advertising or information. So in Japanese for, yeah, and the information is the fact that, as I said, economic philosophy programs are what's needed, where people get educated in it and not only listening to what has been done before. So this is one example of a program that I've been coordinating and that it's running, and that I am willing to associate some Japanese colleagues to. It's already been the case in the special issue of the journal I mentioned. I hope it is even more in the future. This is the journal, the special issue. And again, this is the book. This one actually may be translated into Japanese in some forthcoming future with a Kyoto publisher. We'll see. Also, for those of you who are really interested into developing those aspects, this journal is the place not only to read, but also if you want to propose to submit papers in French and in English, no problem, whatever your choice. This is available, and one of those at international level that you may count on in the field. Actually, Adrienne will be coordinating one special issue at some point in the future, if I understand well. But for now, I am done, and I thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for being a little bit long. Thank you.